Hello and welcome for a Holistic Creative Chat. And this week's guest is Kara Jones, also known as Mother Henna, which you're going to have to tell us about. And Kara is an artist, a writer, and a creative grief educator. And I love it, Kara, because you say that you're more interested in heart making than art making. You're a heartist. Yeah. I love that.
Yes. Yeah, it's interesting to use that language, though, because so many people haven't heard it. Mm-hmm. And it can be kind of confusing. But that confusion is a little space between breaths to kind of talk a little bit about what those things are. Absolutely. And so it was interesting. I did a conference last month, and that was one of the words I used in the presentation. And one of the people who was coordinating said to me, "Can you add a couple sentences in there after you use that word to say what you're talking about?" Mm-hmm. She's like, "I don't want anyone to get stuck there." So, we talked a little bit about that sort of idea that we're human and grief and loss is just part of being alive, even if it's not a major loss, just the flowers on your desk are going to wilt and go on the compost. Mm-hmm. There's some sense of loss in almost everything. And if we get real about that, then each time the heart sort of experiences that and there's a little breaking or a little shattering or there's a major shattering, how are we taking time to reshape the heart and come back to living fully again, right? So I'm doing that a lot through art, but it's not just art making. I've encountered people now, doing it through movement and writing and walking and, anything. Mm-hmm. We humans are just amazingly creative. And I think of all of that as creativity. Some people will go, "Oh, no, I'm not an artist." And I'm like, no, I really think all of that is creativity.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. I love that. Yeah. And I love that using different language as the labels that we call ourselves becomes like a talking point with people about this notion that we're holistic and we're creative at our nature. And I love that you see your creative work as constantly coming back to heart tending. Yeah, that is so important, especially with grief work. It just makes my heart pitter patter. I spent years as a hospice nurse, and I it opened my awareness completely to all the levels in our life where we deal with grief, whether it's the loss of a job or the loss of a loved one. It can be these little itty bitty bits, and it can be these really big things, and there's still this process of grief with it. And it still takes us coming back into the heart space.
Yeah. And I think culturally there's a real lack of conversation about that. We don't really language that in our society as grief.
Yeah, I know.
Someone loses a job or someone loses a house that they love, or even losing full-time custody of your children, having to share custody, how everything changes. We don't language that as grief. We don't talk about it as the loss of something and the recreation of something else. We just don't. I don't know. We don't acknowledge that very well. And so people, a lot of times, if I'm dealing with someone who they've experienced the death of a loved one, they pretty much come with the language. They have the context. But a lot of times I'm dealing with people who've had other kinds of loss. And for them, the idea that grief applies is like, really?
Yes.
Is that true? Oh, okay. I have to think about that. And it breaks something open. It gives them a little bit of permission to start exploring what's really happening for them instead of, we're pretty quick to try to get over it, get to the next thing, fix it, heal it, whatever. But so by giving people some language, it gives them some space to be with what was lost first. I just read something, I can't remember who it was from though, about fully mourning all that was lost. And it wasn't just about the death of a loved one. It was about, really acknowledging what's happening, and then doing whatever comes next, wherever your creativity is going to take you. But having that first space.
That's what it does, I feel, when we really can acknowledge all the feels that we have with it, all the feelings, all the stuff that's shifting. And I have chills from what you're saying, because grief is it's such a personal piece for me too, but it's so important. And I agree wholeheartedly with you that culturally we don't deal with it and it's almost like we see it as like this event of life, that if this
Yeah.
happens, then there's grief, rather than as this continuum that really is kind of happening at different levels on the spectrum through our whole, our whole experience of living. And I had with patients' families a lot, particularly with like dementia or Alzheimer's patients, the patient would still be living.
Yes.
But people are moving through anticipatory grieving and not recognizing that they're already in a grieving process.
Yes.
And
yeah.
just that little
It's
bit of
interesting that
language.
we have this one. Yeah, and it's interesting that we have this one little word, grief, like these little letters. It supposedly covers all of these different experiences. Pauline Boss is a person that I really have appreciated her work over time, because she started writing about ambiguous loss initially with alcoholic families that were dealing with alcoholism. So there's a parent who's physically present, but emotionally and mentally is not really present. And her work has evolved to, her later works are about dementia. And it's the same kind of, so her whole body of work about ambiguous loss and these different phrases she came up with, and the way she talks about what families are going through, is like, oh, okay, thank you. Like, please, yes, I this is a good indicator for where to start talking, but there's so much happening for people.
I love that ambiguous loss. I haven't read her work, but now I'm very interested in checking it out.
Yeah,
That's
she's great.
Yeah.
You would love her. Yeah.
So, okay, so the question I ask everybody, we're just going to kind of jump a little, and I know we're going to circle back. So, but what does your creative practice look like right now?
That's an interesting question because I was on the road for 3 weeks. And so, I part of it was work, and I did a presentation. That part was really creative. But then I kind of had 3 weeks with family, and then the travel back, and kind of I was really exhausted when I came back and slept. So my art making creative practice, I really just picked things up again like 2 nights ago or 3 nights ago. I finally got everything unpacked. It took me that long to even unpack.
Sure.
And I had this sense as I was playing, oh, I really haven't done this in like 4 weeks. Like, I'm really out of practice. Even just seeing what I was going to do and where I was going to go, or letting it go where it wanted to go instead of where I wanted it to go. So that was an interesting kind of thing to have happen. Like, I felt, wow, I hadn't been practicing. Now, I do feel like creativity is much bigger than just my art making. Yeah. So there's a lot of creativity happening in a lot of ways, especially like checking in with my family. I hadn't been back home in a long time. And so I had this great experience I spent a day with my goddaughter, Kristen, and she's now 30. And my previous experiences with her, a lot of my experiences with her was when I was in college and she was a kid, and I'd come home for holidays, and she and her sister would run, and she and Erin would run and greet me and stuff. No, and I loved them. And I have all these great pictures of them as little kids. But so now here we were these many years later, and she and I spent the day at the art museum together as 2 adults. Her children, she has 2 children. They were with their caregiver for the day. And I met this whole new person.
Wow. Yeah. Yeah.
And it was just really, so it was just stuff like that, like reminding myself that my creative practice is this everyday breath, like leaving space for the day to be an improv exercise. Like I have goals and aims and sort of shapes of things where I want to go, but leaving enough space for the day to improv too is a really big, it's an important piece for me,
I can't agree more. And, like you're hitting on like what is so powerful to me about a creative practice in general is that we can become aware of that stuff by doing like maybe the art making or the journal keeping or whatever it is that we do that's our like, the making piece. We can become aware of the rhythms in ourselves and how we approach situations, and then we can start to see how that is mirrored in the way we show up in our day-to-day, in our relationships, and our interactions. And we can go, oh yeah, okay, I'm not necessarily supposed to try to control every moment of this. And I'm supposed to just kind of go with what spontaneously rises and has the juice or, feels really good or what have you, and practice some resiliency. Yeah.
Yeah, well, and that's what we was going to say. We talk a lot about this at the Creative Grief Studio
Mm.
about how a creative practice kind of mirrors the way we practice with our grief,
Yeah.
and in terms of resiliency too. In terms of how we bounce back from shame and loss and guilt, and and we'll have long conversations about these things. And my really, really basic metaphor for it is working a canvas, and I can't see it. I can't see where it's going. I don't like it. Oh, I just hate it. I want to throw it out. I want to burn it. I just want to start over.
Yeah.
But instead, to take a pause and like set it across the room and turn it upside down and sit across the room from it and just observe it for a little bit and see if something emerges, see if there's a space that I want to go to with it. And the same thing happens with my grief. I have really ugly, awful, terrible days with grief where I'm just like, oh, I hate this. I want it to go away. I want it to be over. Like, this is just, I don't want to do this anymore.
Yeah.
But if I pause instead and I breathe with it and I set it out here and I turn grief upside down and I take some time to look at it and try to let something else emerge in my relationship with it,
Mm-hmm.
then some movement happens.
Yeah.
Something juicy will emerge and some space will show itself to me. That's a really different space in conversation and relationship with grief than I want it to be fixed or healed or over or
Absolutely. I
yeah.
love that. I love that you said exactly the language I use too, which is that it's about having a relationship
Yes,
with the
yeah,
piece
yeah,
or the grief or whatever it is that we're discussing,
yeah.
And there's I lost my train of thought, but it'll come back. It'll come back. Because I was thinking,
It's all
I don't know
good.
if you're familiar with the what's called the wise woman tradition and herbalism and that.
Little bit,
A
little
little bit,
bit.
yeah. So there's an approach to healing that very much it's an approach to healing. Susan Weed is an herbalist who kind of came up
Yeah.
with these ideas, and she talks a lot about the wise woman tradition, which goes back much further than her, of course, but it has this sort of organic approach to like, so when something comes up like grief and maybe it's a feeling that you've been through a million times, maybe you've even done the deep soul work, you've done all the things you were supposed to do, and you're like, damn it, aren't I supposed to be done with this now? So so then the question becomes, and it seems a little odd at first, but the question becomes, okay, so what is it that could benefit me? What is the opportunity perhaps in being with this feeling rising again? What is it that something in me needs that I'm not consciously aware of, that's not being, verbalized in my consciousness?
Yeah.
And if we take that question and kind of look at it, well, we can find that maybe we need to slow down. Maybe we just need to let those feelings rise a little and move through. Whatever it is, it can be whatever the answer is. Maybe we aren't tending, it could be literally physically, nourishment or what have you in the right way. But that slowing down brings us into that space. And that's often what I find in my experience. Those type of feelings re-rising are about, they become like signposts for our own journey, and growth.
And I think also even when you've done work, we had 3 experiences with death. We had 3 sons who died at birth.
Oh my
And
gosh.
every experience with it was completely different.
Yeah.
I mean, just because I went through and did what we did with the first time, it was completely different the second time and completely different the third time. And it's almost like, for me, I won't, I'll just say for me, there was the death, that was the event. There was something that happened that was like the catalyst to the grief experience. But the grief experience was this whole other thing. It was, even like besides, beyond the death itself. That was just sort of the beginning seed. And yeah, absolutely, in all 3 cases though, most of my sort of stuckness or the really hard parts were because I wasn't slowing down enough to figure out what I needed in that moment.
Yeah.
I might have been imposing upon myself, well, at this point I should be woulda, coulda, shoulda, as opposed to like just taking that time to breathe and going, oh, I need to rest. Like, oh, I need movement. Like, I need so much movement that my body exhausts itself. Oh, I need like some decent omega-3s in my
Right?
body, Yeah, it can be
Yeah.
really basic stuff. Yeah.
I love that you've brought that up, and what a there's no words, but what a powerful journey you've been through. What an amazing story to have moved through that. And And what a blessing it is. I'm sure that you've come through and are able to help people through their own dynamic grief as well. And I just want to again acknowledge what you just said, because it's so important and powerful. And I saw this again with families and people, and that every time grief shows up, it can show up differently. Even like I've known people who the person that they're closest to in the whole world has passed, and they can't shed a tear, and they don't know why, or they feel relief and they feel guilt over it. And then someone that is not as close to them perhaps has passed, and they're a blubbering mess, and they're everything they thought they should have been for the other, but it's because it moves in different rhythms. I've had people who literally will think they ought to have grieved in one certain way, and it doesn't happen till years later. Years. So I think that's so important to say, that it's going to look different no matter how many times we've done it and how many times we think we know how it ought to go. And to honor that part of the process is also, to me, like a mirror of the creative process working through us, that energy. Yeah.
Well, and I think it's interesting too what you're saying about timeline, because so that's the thing about, sort of the institutional ways of dealing with grief we have in our society, and the DSM and
right. I hear
all
you,
these
sister.
things that put timelines on grief stuff. I just the timeline is so different for everybody, and I really think, again, like the metaphor for me is creativity. Every time I learn a new creative skill, I revisit pieces I've done before, or I revisit how I'm going to do things. Well, I just think that's part of human development. Every time we form a new skill as a human, we're going to revisit the things that happen to us. That's a really well-known thing in child development. At every level of development, children will revisit their traumas and try to make new sense of it and stuff. I don't think that ends just because we turn 20.
Right. Yeah.
That's a human thing. I think that keeps on for us, and so that whole idea that there's a timeline.
Yeah, maybe it should be human development, not so much child development, that takes on that system or approach or perspective. Yeah, I agree with you wholeheartedly. That's great.
And I think the other interesting thing too is what you were saying about how people experience things differently. We, Dr. Harris, Darcy Harris, she does a guest lecture for us at the Creative Grief Studio, and she's really talking about the oppression of grief. And what I like about her language is that she really talks about trying to identify what's happening in the grief experience that feels oppressive for the person sitting in front of you. So I might be with one person who they're feeling like the oppressive part of this experience is X, Y, and Z. But a week later, I see somebody else, and X, Y, and Z doesn't feel oppressive to them at all. They have a completely different experience going on. So for me as a practitioner, and just as a person, just to notice for myself, to not get stuck in, well, X, Y, and Z is going to mean this, and it's going to happen then, and this is what you do to address it. That just doesn't work. It's too dynamic.
Well, and I would go so far as to say, because I just love that you're bringing this stuff up, because it's like the nurse in me is just like, ooh, I love it. Because I think that we can go so far as to say that this is like advanced caregiving, and that we shouldn't apply the XYZ idea to anything when we're caregiving to an individual. That's like, and
to ourselves. I mean,
exactly.
It always comes back, right?
Exactly. So I have two more questions I want to ask you.
Okay.
And the first one is just about, it's about your Spectrum offering this year. So you're a Spectrum contributor for Spectrum 2015. I'm very thrilled. Yay. And you're bringing a workshop with a really tantalizing title, Alternatives to Slaying the Dragon. Can you just tell us a little bit more about that? Because I think it's going to be a powerful one for people.
Yeah, so it comes out of my experience with the hero's journey. I did a certification process for about 7 years between Reiki master teaching and my coaching certification. And I was such an odd duck with my coaching certification that Shireen Zolno, who runs the Leading Clinic, which is where I got my certification, she was willing to work with me in a more customized way, because I didn't really fit into exactly the mainstream kind of program. And so she helped me really key into the hero's journey as the model for, kind of the foundational exploration and learning and understanding for my coaching work. And, that included of course, Joseph Campbell and Carol Pearson and Paul Reblow and all of the kind of standard things you find in the hero's journey and the heroine's journey, because then some people take it to the masculine, feminine, even though I think it's just a people thing. But that's a whole other conversation.
Yep.
But so kind of, I mean, this is a really sort of dumbed down kind of version, but the hero's journey is sort of like that fairy tale thing. There's a hero and there's a dragon, and you slay the dragon and you get the prize or whatever.
Right.
And for me, you know, in my own grief experience, as the hero walking whatever path was unfolding in front of me, because it certainly wasn't the path I intended on walking. It just kind of opened up in front of me.
Yeah.
The dragon I was going to encounter, and like I said, with the deaths of 3 boys, was grief. I mean, that was my dragon.
Yeah.
And for me, the idea of enacting more trauma or violence to slay that dragon in order to be healed or to get the prize or whatever the thing was on the flip side,
yeah,
it just wasn't gonna happen. Even physically, like, my body was like, no, we're not doing that. And so I have been working from that idea in a way. I'm still using the hero's journey as a key model in everything I'm doing, but it's like the hero's journey is the framework, and I'm kind of going.
I love that. I love that.
And so that's kind of where this session that I'm doing for Spectrum comes from. Is so if slaying the dragon works for you, awesome.
Right.
Like, there's
if XYZ works for you, awesome.
Exactly. There's tons of books out there. There's lots of stuff out there about slaying the dragon. That, you know, there's much support for it. But if you're interested in an alternative to slaying the dragon, there's not a lot that's really obvious out there. Not even just about it, but also about figuring out, well, what alternative do you want then?
Right.
And so that's kind of what the module that I did is about. Is like, well, so how do you figure out
Love
what's your own alternative? What do you want to do here?
Very good. I'm very excited to dive into that one myself. So
yeah.
All right, so the question I ask everybody for these chats is, how do you define healing today?
Oh, that's interesting. I think what's come for me after 16 years of doing this work every day is that healing is as dynamic as grief and creativity is. And so, you know, when I started this path, I thought healing was a thing or a state that you got to, you know, that perfect place and everything was healed and fixed and wonderful and grief was over and, you know, that perfection kind of space. I feel like healing is an ongoing process of practicing how I'm going to live wholeheartedly. Right. And so that process of living wholeheartedly includes re-encountering grief, re-encountering love, continuing my practice of breathing, my practice of art making, heart making, my practice of teaching, my practice of creating community. So I don't think there's a space where things come together and I'm like, but and like some cartoon bubble appears above me and says, healed. Like,
you have arrived.
Arrived. And then you're there forever and everything's wonderful. It's so much more dynamic.
Yeah.
Than that for me now. But that's come out of, you know, the folly and foibles of 16 years of messing around with different ideas and things.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, so healing is dynamic, I think, is probably the the sound bite for it. Indeed.
Oh, Kara, thank you so much for sharing so openly and so joyfully. You're just a delight.
I'm so glad we got to meet up today. It's really fun.
Me too. Me too. And thank you everybody for listening in too. See you next time.
Thanks, everyone.